So just by way of introduction for myself and for my co-host here, Jacob Tarowski, as you see on the screen, my name is Logan McCoy, and I am the Vice President of Services. I've been with CCB Technology for just coming up on about 14 years here, actually, in June. Started on our sales team and then moved over to our technical services team back in 2015. So I oversee everything from our professional services side, and I also see everything from our managed services team as well. Jacob, I'm going to turn it over to you just to give a quick intro, and then we'll keep moving forward.
Sure, thanks, Logan. So as Logan said, I'm Jacob Tarowski. I'm our Director of Enterprise Architecture. I've been with CCB for about 7 years here now. I've been doing IT for about 15, 16 years, I think. And so I work very closely with Logan. I kind of oversee our project team and then help drive a lot of what technologies we're looking at. So what type of servers we're going to implement, what switches we're using, and things like that, and then putting that together into our services portfolio, and then what we're able to offer to our clients.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. If you've been on any presentations that I've done in the past here, you probably know that he's going to start with some type of statistic, right? I love statistics and numbers from that perspective. And this one really stood out to me. And it stood out to me because, as for many of us, things massively changed just over a year ago, right? For many of us, what we had known for our entire working career, especially for myself, of going into the office every single day, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, I was there, right? That was my life. That's what I knew. Was within basically a day, a decision that we made as a company completely put on its head. And now everything was remote, everything, not actually allowed to come into the office type of a thing, right? Many of us experienced that. And this data point that I'm going to show up here really harkens to that. It alludes to that truth there that many of us actually experienced in our own personal lives. And it was this, that in March of 2020 last year, the number of Teams meetings minutes increased from 560 million minutes to 2.7 billion. That's an increase of 380%. That's an incredible increase. And when you think about it, had Microsoft, I think, had a little bit more put together for Teams, that number probably would have been even higher, right? Because so many people were going to Zoom or to other competitors to Teams that you would think that if they actually had a solution that was in line at the time, because in many cases over the last 3, 4, 5, 6 months, Microsoft has made some major leaps and advancements with Teams, to the point of where now obviously they're in some cases ahead of Team or of Zoom or of Ring Central, whatever it might be, or just right on par, right? But that number alone, even with what you're seeing, a 380% increase just in that 1 month of it continuing to grow, right? Which just harkens to the fact of what we all know, right? It points to the reality that most people went remote starting in March or April of last year. And the interesting thing now is, for a lot of organizations, they're trying to determine what's going to be our new normal. What does this look like? Are we going back to the office full time? Are we doing hybrid? Are we going to go remote? But there's definitely been some major advantages, right? As we've seen in utilizing solutions like Teams or Zoom or just different cloud-based applications, right? But the point of all of that is we have seen this massive explosion of these types of applications and how they've come to the forefront of how we operate as an organization, and also how we operate outside of our organization, whether it's client facing or with vendors, right? For us, Teams is absolutely critical for us to be able to communicate and accomplish what we have to do on a day-to-day basis, which also means that the data and the communications and the content and everything that's put into something like Teams becomes all that more important, right? Because less and less is getting saved on the file server and more is getting saved onto Teams or onto SharePoint on the back end, right? And this is true for a lot of clients that we've seen. I've done more Teams trainings this past year than I ever have, because more people are utilizing Teams. And all these data points I'm talking about, I'm really just talking about Teams at this point. Obviously, when we expand out Microsoft 365 as a whole, you have email as a key core functionality in all of that, right? You have SharePoint and OneDrive and a number of the other applications that are all part of that as well. But Teams, in many ways, really coming to the forefront. Because of all of this usage and of what this looks like, the need and the reason for why you should be backing up your data that's in Microsoft 365, in my opinion, has just increased all the more. It's always been important, it's always been relevant, but even more so now because of what we're seeing, where more and more of that data and content is being put into 365. The discussion needs to be had around, do you need a backup solution for this? And if so, what does that look like, and why do you need that? And something that I'll just elaborate onto from what you see on the screen here, right, is 6 key reasons why you need to back up your data in 365. when I'm really going through these 6 reasons, a big thing that you're going to kind of see a consistent theme is going beyond what most client expectations are because of what they think Microsoft is doing, or just what the Microsoft solution, native kind of solution is in and of itself. So when we're looking at this, what I really kind of want you to think about is, why should you really be looking at a backup solution that is outside of the Microsoft ecosystem to back up your Microsoft data in 365? Hopefully that gives a little bit more of context as we start going through these as to what those 6 reasons really are all about. So jumping into those, the very, very first one, and this one I love to start with because it's just so compelling. Microsoft recommends it. So you have your data in Microsoft 365, and they're telling you you should look to a third-party solution to back up that data. I'm going through the process right now of building a house, actually, and I've come to my builder a number of times, and he's recommended you should go to this person who we subcontract with, or you should go here for what they do this. And the reasons all vary, right? They're more skilled. This is all they do. They're efficient at it. I can do it, but it's not my thing. I know that you're going to be covered under a warranty because of when they do it, all those kinds of reasons, right? The thing is, I trust my builder because he knows what he's doing in that regard, right? And so if Microsoft themselves are recommending it, that you should look at something outside of themselves, there's got to be a reason for it, right? And I'm actually going to stop the presentation here to show you Microsoft's own service level agreement, because you might say, what do you mean they recommend it, right? So if you could easily do a Google search. You could just go to Microsoft.com, and all this / here to services agreement, right? If you go down to service availability right here, and I've got it highlighted just to make sure I didn't miss it, right? They actually say this. They say, we strive to keep your services up and running. However, all online services do suffer occasional disruptions and outages, and Microsoft is not liable for any disruption or loss that you may suffer as a result. In the event of an outage, you may not be able to retrieve your content or data that you've stored, which is why we recommend that you regularly back up your content and data that you store on the services or store using third-party apps and services, right? So they themselves are recommending you really should look at backing up your data. This is a key thing that you should be looking to do. And they even say, even potentially using that within a third-party app or service in that regard, right? So if Microsoft is recommending it, it's something that you definitely should take note of, right? And the main reason for that is because that agreement that you've more or less signed once you've entered into the whole Microsoft 365 stack, that's a part of what you're doing with them. The reason why is because Microsoft is going to guarantee to the best of their ability the availability of the service, but they do not in any way, shape, or form guarantee the retention of your data, which is why they're stressing you need to be backing that up, right? And so often when we talk with clients about your data in 365, they'll come back and they'll say to us, hey, but my data's in the cloud. It should be safe. It should be secure. I shouldn't have to worry about backups anymore from this standpoint, right? And there's obviously certain elements of that that are true. I mean, yes, from the perspective of you don't really need to worry anymore truly about a hardware failure from this point, right? And so let's say someone was storing an Excel file on their desktop, that laptop got corrupted, the hard disk or hard drive just kind of went belly up, and there were no other backups of that data. It's just gone, kind of a thing, right? Yes, it is in a sense kind of removing that because you're now storing it in the cloud from that perspective. So you're mitigating some of those risks. But there's a ton of other risks that just because your data is in the cloud doesn't mean that it's any less susceptible necessarily to some of those same, I'd say, incidents or issues that might happen just as if that data was living on-prem, which is, again, why if you knew it was important to back up the data on-prem, we also should be having a serious discussion around, does it make sense to back it up even though it's cloud-based, right? And a big part of that, as I mentioned earlier, that I'll just reiterate, is because Microsoft guarantees the availability of that service, but not the retention of your data. The next reason really is all around that Microsoft's native retention features are often lacking. So one thing that a lot of people are told early on when they're moving to 365 is there's this dynamic of soft delete and hard delete. Soft delete meaning if a user goes in or an admin goes in and they delete a file, a user account, an email, whatever it might be, that will go, unless it's permanently deleted right after that, because you can do that manually. But if it's just deleted initially, it kind of enters this weird limbo, this purgatory, we'll call it, of soft delete. It's not completely removed, but it's also not necessarily visible. You kind of have to come in and recover it basically from the soft delete, we'll call it, or the recycle bin for lack of a better way to say it right now. And natively or by default, that soft delete period is set for 14 days. And you can go in and you can increase that for up to a maximum of 30 days. So for up to a maximum of 30 days, if a user goes in and they do a soft delete, you might be able to go in and then retrieve that data. And I say might because most of the time you are able to, but I've seen situations and scenarios where you're not, right? So that's just a key thing to know and be aware of. But regardless of if you can or can't, you have 30 days. You have 30 days to go in and try and retrieve that data, because at 30 days, what Microsoft says is we are going to go in then and do a hard delete, which means we're permanently deleting that data. There's no other copies. There's no other way to restore it. It is 100% wiped. Um, there have been very few occasions where a situation like that has happened, and for some reason, Microsoft has been able to retrieve it. Most of the time when that has happened, 9 times out of 10, that data truly is gone. Microsoft is sticking by that, right? And you might think, well, how often does that happen, and what does that look like, right? And the scenario that I'll give to you, that is one that we've seen quite often, actually. A lot of people, when they think of data, they just think of their emails, they think of their files. They don't necessarily think from an IT perspective also about their user accounts, right? And user account information is technically a form of data, right? And so if you have a user that's been, whether they've been let go or they've left the organization, so many people, they want to keep that data, right? And for so many people, what that means is they're not necessarily converting it to a shared mailbox or anything like that. They're keeping that account around for a period of time, then they're disabling it, and then maybe at some point they're deleting it, right? Something that we have seen so often from admins is, hey, I was told initially that I could go in and completely then just delete this account. We don't need it anymore. And then come to find out, more than 30 days, we actually need access to this account for X, Y, and Z reason. There's no way to retrieve that. If it's been deleted in that time frame, it's gone, kind of a thing, right? Meaning past the 30 days from just what Microsoft has natively built within there, which again, a lot of people don't necessarily think of those scenarios, but those are ones that we see all the time where this wasn't even malicious. This was just the admin doing what they were told of, yep, I can delete it, not need it anymore. And then whoever that user was, oftentimes in HR or someone on the executive team, realizing, oh no, I actually need that. Can we restore that? But because it's not something they're accessing daily, the fact of it going 30 days is quite it's quite probable it happens. Like, we've actually seen that very thing, right? And in addition to that, when you actually start to look at the native tools that Microsoft has, one, it's not a cost savings. In many cases, it's cost prohibitive, and oftentimes it's not as feature rich as varying third-party solutions. There's a reason that we don't use Microsoft native tools, and I'd be the first to say we're a big Microsoft partner. We use their solutions in and out. We've been with them for probably 25, if not more, years of our 30 plus years of being in business. So we are a big Microsoft partner. I don't say that lightly, but when we've used it ourselves to help manage it for our clients, whether it was something native in 365 or we were using Azure or DPM or whatever else it might have been, we've seen that, one, from a cost perspective, you're typically not saving anything. In most cases, you're spending more. And then it oftentimes doesn't actually provide a lot of those features and functionality that the third-party applications do, because that's what they do. That's all they focus on. That's what they're designed to do, type of a thing. So another major reason is that Microsoft's native retention features, whether it's just what you have right there and then off of the kind of 30-day maximum soft delete, is lacking. And then even beyond that, some of the actual Microsoft native tools, right, is a big reason. The third reason is really about protecting against malicious attacks. And this is really both from external and or internal resources, right? And when I say internal, oftentimes, people think I really don't have people that I think are going to come in and try and do that. And I think that's true. So most of the time when we talk about internal, as I'll get to it in a moment here, you're often seeing things happen from it's not a malicious reason, right? It's typically accidental or benign from that perspective, but it still does happen, right? But as we talk about it from an external standpoint, ransomware alone is top of mind for a lot of IT decision makers. I was actually just reading a report about 365, and it was a report taken by a third party. And what they surveyed of, I think, around 1,000 IT decision makers, is that 83% of them are concerned about ransomware in some way, shape, or form on their 365 tenant. And then it goes down to justify why, and it's because of those, 64% of them have already fallen victim to ransomware in some way, shape, or form. And we've seen this for a number of clients. And the reality is that your Microsoft 365 tenant is one of the key targets. You've probably seen the explosion of phishing attempts that has happened, right? Because that alone, which is a little bit different than we're talking about ransomware here, but nonetheless a malicious attempt, is that they're trying to gain access to your 365 tenant by getting those credentials, right? Oftentimes it comes in, hey, your password's expiring, please update it here. Your user goes in and updates it, and now they have access to your tenant, right? And oftentimes you're not even aware of it. They're just sitting there gathering data, finding, okay, who's at the top of the food chain? Who has the financial data? Who's got the key data that I know they actually need, right? It might not even be in 365, but now I know who that is, and I'm going to start targeting that user type of a thing. So we've seen a massive explosion around attempts to hack 365 tenants as a whole, more than probably almost anything else in that regard, because it's pretty easy because you're able to focus on the user, and also because it's highly effective, right? And so in the case of backing this up, just to give you a real world scenario that we have seen situations where someone's tenant was hacked, like completely hacked. They were taken over. Global admin was there. They removed all their global admins. They shut everything down. They could not send email. They could not access their data in their 365 tenant. They were locked out, truly locked out. And in that case, if they didn't have a backup solution outside of that was pulling that data down, that data, they were essentially beholden to the hacker at that point. There's nothing that you could have done in that regard. And so we've actually seen ourselves from that scenario, clients who have come to us that we're not managing, but they've come to us saying, hey, this just happened, what do we do? And the first thing we try to go for is, do you have a backup of that data from 365? Because if so, this changes the narrative and the story and the strategy that we're going to go after all of this, versus all of my data is in there, I have no other backup copy of it, and this is now where I'm at, kind of a thing. Those are two totally different paths of what we're taking things, obviously with one that is much more serious in that sense. So we're seeing a huge proliferation of this from an external side. But the other thing that we're seeing, and this came from that same data report, is from the internal side, though it oftentimes might not be malicious, more than 3/4 of the time that IT is asked to recover something that happened from an internal issue, it was because of an accidental deletion. Right, so you're seeing a lot of protecting against malicious attacks that are happening from the outside, and from the inside, you're often seeing these more or less accidental deletion type things, right? And I can actually speak to this from my own perspective. When we were very early on into Microsoft Teams, we were also then very early on within Microsoft Office 365 groups, right, or Microsoft 365 groups. And if you know anything from the technical backend side, Microsoft really made a fairly significant architectural change to how you were able to manage your 365 ecosystem, that tenant, right? And groups were a key foundation to all of that, because those groups that really sat at a foundational level allowed you to set permissions that would carry to things that would be affected both in Exchange and Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive, like all across the board, right? And from an administrative side, that's phenomenal. But it also means that if a change then in many cases is made in one of those buckets, so let's say Teams in this regard, it's often changing it across all of those different areas that it's now affected, because they're all tied together. So the real world example that I'll give to you is when we were very early on in Teams, I was testing things out, and I had put some data in there that actually came from and existed in Microsoft Planner, a little bit of a lesser known application that's more or less like a Project Lite that Microsoft has, and it integrates really nicely into Teams. So I had pulled that into and integrated that into Microsoft Teams. And when I was going through and testing it out, there were some things in there that I thought, I don't really need it. I can pull it out from Planner. We'll just kind of go from there. And I went in and I deleted that entire team within Microsoft Teams. So I had integrated it into a team and then thought, I don't really need it in Teams here. I'll just go and access it in Planner. Because I had integrated those, and because from a foundational level, those were all tied to a 365 group, when I said, I just want to delete that in Teams, what I was in that moment saying is, I also want to delete everything essentially related to that 365 group. So a few days later, and I'm lucky it was a few days later, then in that case, I went back into Planner and I realized my data's not there. Where is this? And thought, I remember deleting this. Is this all tied to it? Real world example and scenario, which this was years and years and years ago, but one that we see quite often for users, because as Microsoft has changed the game and a lot of how these things are structured, it's now the reality that accidental deletion in some cases is becoming much more common. And that's also because one of the biggest things we see is that as Teams has exploded, the management and kind of permissions and just overall ongoing administration of it in some cases is lax, meaning that users who might not have had that same type of ability to delete or edit or modify files on-prem now have that within Teams, right? And so because they have that ability, oftentimes, again, it's not malicious, but they're going in and they're accidentally deleting it. And if you don't have a backup, that's actually outside of Microsoft that extends beyond that whole soft delete 30-day window, that data in many cases very likely could be gone, right? So another big thing to kind of note into all of this is really protecting yourself against whether it's a malicious attack from that we see externally, or even just potentially something internally that we would see from an accidental deletion site is often what happens. But another big reason number 5 about why you should be looking at this is because a lot of times people say, okay, so I still have this 30-day window, right? That's okay. Like most of the times if something's deleted, I'm going to go and find that. And the reality of all of this is even if that's true for you, where you're typically if something gets deleted, someone's going to be aware of it pretty quickly and you can go and restore it. That ability to restore is not the easiest. And oftentimes what we've seen is because it's not easy and because it's kludgy and because you're not necessarily to get granular in a lot of cases, when they're going and they're restoring something, they might go and actually restore an entire folder, which is rewriting over data that might be in the existing folder that actually now is no longer there because it's been overwritten, it's been restored type of a thing. So they went and worked on a different file over the last 3 days. That's all, that whole folder is getting restored and it's rewriting over that file that actually had been modified over the last few days, right? So in order to be able to actually do an effective restore, you need to be able to do it from a granular perspective. You need to be able to restore the whole file if you need to, and just that file. You need to be able to restore the whole folder if you need to, right? You need to be able to restore things specific to just that user. And so there's all of those dynamics of if you're just using what Microsoft has built in, the reality is it's not a backup solution and it's not going to function in that way. And so when you're trying to do a restore from the mindset of a backup, it's not going to probably outwork itself in the way you would expect a typical backup solution to do, because you want those backups to be granular so that you're able to actually restore those from only what needs to be, but also from a timing perspective. The more you have to restore, the longer it often takes. So that's another key one there within all of that. The next one is really, it was a big one for us around why we started looking at different third-party solutions. And it really came down to reporting and monitoring and having the ability to test these backups effectively, right? Because Microsoft does have some of them natively, but one of the biggest things we've felt that we've struggled with Microsoft from a security and backup side is that at times it can seem like a black box. You set something up, you don't have a great reporting, the ability to see things from a notification perspective. It can feel, to use the word again, a bit kludgy type of a thing. And so for us, as we're monitoring this for our clients, we need to be able to see these and have good visibility in them. And more importantly, to be able to see what's important, right? Because the massive increase of data over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's not the issue now of having the data, it's trying to synthesize that down into what data is relevant and what do I do on this, right? But having our ability to actually report on that data quickly and our ability to monitor that, right? So if a backup job fails, what does that look like? Why does it fail? How do we restore that type of a thing, right? How do we restore that backup job? And then even just the ease of use of being able to test these backups, which I always recommend of backups, whether you're doing it on-prem for your on-prem infrastructure, whether you're doing it cloud-based, test them, whether that's on a semi-annual, a quarterly basis, an annual, whatever it might be, test your backups, because we have seen so many scenarios where someone has had a backup solution in place and they kind of set it and forget it. And in many cases, the backup jobs start failing because either it needs an update, there's whatever reason it might be, they have no notifications turned on and those backup jobs fail for the next 6 months. So they have a backup, but it's 6 months old type of a thing. So that's a huge aspect and dynamic there, right? Of being able to monitor, to test, to get those notifications, to see when I do that test, then does it restore to the point that I would expect it to restore? All of those things are huge. And being able to have a solution that allows you to do that seamlessly and easily. Whoops. When I stop moving, my light turns off. I think that happened in the last one too. And last but not least, but this is oftentimes the big one, time. One of the things that we've seen is that if anybody's trying to do things natively or they don't have a backup solution, if an incident actually happens where data is lost, whether it's one key file, an entire folder, it could be an entire server in some cases, thinking outside of 365 now, and you have to go and restore that. If you don't have a good backup strategy in place, you haven't been monitoring it, you haven't been testing that, it's going to take a ton of time to restore that. And that time is both a huge time suck from your IT staff side of the house, but even more so from the business perspective, right? Because when you can't get to that data, when you can't access it, when you can't function off of what you need to from a business perspective, that impacts the business as a whole. And so one of the biggest reasons from a high level overarching perspective is put in the time now to save yourself that time later is more or less really what that looks like. So those are 6 of the reasons. There's a ton more that you could potentially kind of talk through and work through, but those are often some of the key six ones that we often go through when we're talking about this with clients. And so when you're looking at a backup solution, specifically for 365, what do you want to be looking for, right? And again, in the same kind of vein here as it was with the previous slide, I'm really only going to go through about 5, but there's a number of things, right? And these are where, as we have those conversations with you, we're really going to try and work through what are the most important, what's critical for you, and what can we help navigate for you on to make sure that you're finding the right solution. But regardless of what solution it is, it should be secure. And for many of you, I know that you have to adhere to some type of compliance, whether it's HIPAA, PCI, whatever it might be, right? And so you want to make sure that, yes, from a base level, it's secure, but even then beyond that, what's going to be required for you to make sure that that solution is set up properly to adhere to those compliances? Because a lot of times those solutions out of the box, they're not going to come and say, yes, you just set this up, you just do the base setup and you're compliant. There's a lot more to it oftentimes that you have to do to make sure that the way you're setting it up and customizing it to your organization is then now adhering to a lot of those compliances that you might have, right? But from a foundational level, it has to start with that solution being secure, right? The next thing is you really have to have a good, simple backup and retention policy management. And this is where I would say it really should extend beyond just 365 and encompass more or less everything that you're doing from a backup perspective, right? 365 should align, and in some cases it's going to differentiate itself, but should in many cases align with what you're already doing from a backup side of the house. The next one is something I've already mentioned, but having the ability to do a granular restore, which from a backup solution, truthfully, that's been around for years, right? That's just kind of a core function. But what does that granular restore look like? Does that function in the way that you intend it to? If you're doing a demo or doing an actual trial, put it through its paces. Take a file and do an actual restore. And what does that look like? Is it meeting your expectations of what you think that should look like, right? The other big thing, and a lot of the providers out there are doing this now, oftentimes they would do this based on, like, you'd have to buy a user license, and then you'd also have to account for the amount of storage that you might have in email or OneDrive and SharePoint or Teams. Most of them now are doing unlimited storage, but I have seen a few that still aren't. And so a big thing to kind of just take into account is my data in 365 is going to grow over time. And that means if I'm doing this with a solution that's on a per gig basis as well, my costs are going to increase. Well, it would be nice if I just had unlimited storage and my costs from a per gig per data size of the house don't increase, and maybe they only increase because I'm adding users, or maybe it's decreasing because I'm reducing users, type of a thing. That would be the other big one, right? And last but not least, and I mentioned this in the last slide too, but reporting and monitoring. What does that look like for you guys of what you need to be able to see from a notification perspective? It was really interesting because actually on the last slide, I forgot to mention it, but another data point around this is that 75% of the IT decision makers that were surveyed in there wanted to have some kind of reporting and monitoring, which I actually thought was kind of low, because truthfully, every time I've talked to an IT decision maker, they want some kind of reporting and monitoring, especially on their backups, right? They want it on a number of key aspects in their environment, but backups is one of those, because they want to know if a backup job is failing. They want to know if a restore failed. They want to know if they're reaching their data size limits in whatever capacity that might be, right? They want that type of reporting and monitoring. They also want to see, like, yeah, this was exported, this was restored and then pulled out. They want to see those things even just from an overall data protection standpoint. So a big thing in your mind to just kind of have in with all of that is the reporting and monitoring aspect should be a key one that you should kind of take into account and see what do they provide, and is that sufficient for what you would need as an organization. And especially if you're an IT decision maker, maybe you're the IT director, IT manager, oftentimes you're having to report that, right? It could be the CFO, the CEO, whoever it might be. And you're thinking, okay, what's going to be that effective reporting that's also going to be helpful for them? Because I'm good to get into the nitty gritty and to dive through some of these deeper reports, but what's some of that reporting that's also going to be helpful for them to see of, hey, this is what happened. These were all the successful backup jobs that we had. We had this incident. We were able to restore back to this edition, so on and so forth, right? Back to this version. So those are great things to just keep in mind from a reporting, and monitoring standpoint. Now, before I get into the next slide here, which is essentially just around Q&A, one thing that I do want to mention within all of this is something that we try to offer and do within Microsoft 365 backups, right, is we have some clients that we know they want the solution themselves. They want to just to be able to procure it, to set it up themselves, and to manage it themselves. And we offer that type of solution as well. Some clients want to be able to procure it. They want us to implement it, but then they want to manage it. We have that type of solution as well. And some clients say, I want you to do everything from soup to nuts. I want you to come in and I want you to implement it and I want you to manage it. I want you to be responsible for it. If there's an incident and we have to do a restore, I want that to be part of the coverage. We do that as well, right? And so one of the key things that I think is a few slides on down that we'll do is when we set up a call with you to discuss this, we'll really kind of try and tailor the solution around your needs of what you're looking for and of what you want. And not just based on the solution itself, but also with how you want to engage with CCB. Because we have clients on all sides of the house, all, the kind of the whole spectrum, right? The whole gamut of things of what I just mentioned there from one side to the other. And so for that, one of the key things just to know is on the back end of lot what we're doing and what we're recommending. I'd say there's two vendors out there that we really have been impressed with that have been out there for a long time. And I think from what we've worked with and done for clients on have a really good solid solution. One is Acronis and the other is Barracuda. And without getting too much deeper into that, some of the big things that we really kind of would say, okay, so what's better than Acronis or Barracuda? A lot of that times that comes down to, again, your organization and what you need. If you're just looking at backup, we might recommend this. If you're looking at backup and security, we might recommend this as an example. So what we do in those calls is we try and just distill down what's critical to you, and then based on that, provide our best recommendation in that regard, right? So that you can obviously have something that's tailored to your specific needs, both in the solution itself and within how you want to engage with CCB. So it looks like we are at a Q&A time. So I've got a few questions here that came in that we've saved kind of for the very end. And then I think we've got another one as well that we can try and answer. So the first one that I've got up here is someone had asked, so for most of these offerings, am I able to choose what I want to back up? So what I'm taking that as you're saying is, am I able to choose what I want to back up between Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams? And the answer is yes. Every single one of those solutions that we work with does give you that ability. If you want to do just Exchange, if you want to do just SharePoint, if you want to do absolutely everything, you do have the ability to decide in that regard, which does actually bring up a really, really good point, which ties into the next question here actually, which is, do these solutions cover Microsoft Teams? And that's a good question because up until recently, I'd say within the last 4, 5, or 6 months, the answer would have been no. Most of those solutions would have said, yeah, we'll back up the SharePoint data on the back end. We'll back up things maybe pertaining to the 365 group. But what a lot of those solutions are doing now, like for example, within Acronis, they are actually backing up Microsoft Teams. And what they're saying by that is, and I'll just go off of what they say here so I don't butcher it, is that it will include the team's names, the members list, the channels, the contents, as well as any team mailboxes, meetings, and team sites, right? So it really is pretty much everything that you see within that Microsoft 365 Teams is being backed up as well from that side. Another question here that I got from Lisa was, our server cloud backup keeps all files forever, even if we delete off of our server.
I was just answering that one to Logan in the chat.
Okay, do you want to just,
answer it.
Well, you can answer it. Go for it, Jacob.
Sure. So most of these solutions are centered around retention policies. And so the idea is that once a file is backed up, it is there for whatever you set for that retention policy, even if it's deleted from the source, whether that be a Microsoft Teams share, if that were related to a user's mailbox, things like that, or a OneDrive file or folder. And so you can specify those retention policies per different sources. So you could say, hey, keep this Teams data for 6 years, 7 years is kind of often the de facto standard for HIPAA. If you wanted them indefinitely, you could say, hey, go ahead and keep this indefinitely. A lot of times too, you can change that per mailbox depending on the different solutions. So if you wanted, say, your C-level staff and executives to maybe have an indefinite retention, but your normal sales staff or things like that, you wanted just to keep it for, say, 3 years, you can do that as well. So it's all centered around those retention policies that you then assign to that data. And so once you back that file up, if we back it up on today's backup here, and you go ahead and delete that file tomorrow, and we've told it to keep it indefinitely, at any point that we go back to there, as early as next week, a year from now, 2 years from now, you'd be able to go ahead and retrieve that file.
And Jacob, I know you answered this one already from Will, but I think it's a great question. So I'm going to
Yeah, I was
read it
going to
out and then,
expand. Yeah, I was going to
yeah.
expand on that one. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read
Yeah,
that one there?
you know what, you go for it. Why don't you kind of let the rest of the audience know what the question was and then
Sure.
give
So
that
we had
response.
a question from Will that said, how do you respond to people who think that using the built-in Microsoft legal hold or retention capabilities are substitutes for a third-party backup? And so if you guys haven't seen there, if you head down to the QA, you can expand that and there'll be some options there for, what's open and answered and those type of things. And so within there for things, what I had responded to is the biggest difference there is in relation to what the purpose is for those two type of technologies or features, right? Litigation hold is really set up for the purpose of preserving data for the purpose of an investigation or e-discovery, if there's any compliance people out there, right? And it's not structured around necessarily restoring it. Most importantly, we talked about kind of this in-place restore or things like that, or even in some cases, giving end users, the ability to go ahead and jump in and do a self-service restore is available in some of the solutions that are out there. In this case, there are a number of permissions that you have to give to a particular user, pretty high up when it comes to permissions kind of within your 365 tenant. They have to do an e-discovery search. They then have to go ahead and restore that to a PST and then go grab the messages out of that PST and kind of bring them back into the original mailbox. So from a backup standpoint, it's really not a great process to do that. And then as I mentioned there as well, a large factor of what's considered a backup is an additional copy of your data. And so in this case, it's kind of preserving it in place, and it's not necessarily moving an additional copy of that outside of your 365 tenant. And so as I mentioned in there, if you were to suffer a breach or Microsoft had some sort of catastrophic failure or things like that, all of that information is in your tenant. It'd be no different than essentially taking your backups and putting your backups on an external drive that's sitting right next to your server. If the server room has a fire or flood or electrical disaster or things like that, all of those are in one place and they don't really do you any good. So in this case, those third-party solutions are getting that data out of your tenant in order to have an additional copy that you could then go, it's just an email format. So if you needed to restore that back into your same tenant, a completely different tenant, if it came to the fact that you needed to spin up an Exchange server on premise or something like that and pull things back, you have that data to do so. It's not sitting in that litigation hold side of things. Another big thing to expand on there then for that one is to also talk through what the licensing and storage requirements look like for data that's in litigation hold. So when a user is subject to a litigation or a legal hold or an in-place hold, in order to keep that data, you have to continue to license that user. So it also means then if you're an organization and you have 150 or 200 licensed mailboxes, licensed users, and you want to cycle through those licenses, if you have a certain amount of retention, you need to keep your data for 3 years or 5 years or some other portion of compliance there, you then have to keep that user licensed for that entire time in order to keep that data in the hold. It also means that within there, so you're paying for that extra potential license for that portion. It also means that a lot of these solutions, when we talked about retention, it's kind of that rolling period is most common. As Lisa had asked, there are some scenarios where you might want to keep that indefinitely, and those are out there. There are other scenarios though where it's very common to keep a rolling 5 or 7 years, even a 10-year period sometimes. And so the process there is that you're dropping off that data as it ages out. In a litigation hold, you also don't have that capability, so you just kind of continue to grow your storage capacity, storage usage, sort of indefinitely from that standpoint. And then the last piece that I would add there of why those just really don't make sense from that portion of stuff too, is that, if you're in there from that process to talk about, grabbing any type of data out of there, as we mentioned, granular recovery doesn't necessarily exist there from that standpoint. But the other piece of that too is when you're talking about what you're backing up, all of those pieces being in one place there when you're doing that hold portion, they don't necessarily always restore in the same way that you'd want them to. Email messages are one thing. When we start talking about files and teams and that other pieces of data, they don't necessarily fit into that mold in the same way. And so you end up kind of being limited there from that standpoint of what you're looking at to pull in from a hold perspective, as that data grows and everything there of what you're actually even to fully back up from that perspective.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jacob. I think that that's probably.
Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like and share it if you found value, and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube page so you can stay up to date and current with all the videos we release.